For those of you who haven't met Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, you're in for a treat. She is the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. She is also the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. As many of you know, and as I hope many of you participated, the Poor People's Campaign organized the largest coordinated wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in 21st century America and is actively promoting and encouraging folks to listen to the voices of people who have long been silenced here in the United States. Reverend Dr. Liz also, besides being a director and a co-chair, is an organizer and has worked for well over 20 years organizing here in the United States, as well as a biblical scholar. Her PhD is from Union in New Testament and origins of Christianity, and she's a mom and a member of the Presbyterian Church USA. And I'm so very, very happy that she has decided to join us and will share some of her insights on how her faith has informed her work and what is so very, very important about faith leaders and our voices of faith being part of the Poor People's Campaign, both locally in our regions, statewide, in New York State, as well as nationally. So, Reverend Dr. Liz, are you good to go?
I can be good to go. Yeah, it's so good to see you, Reverend Beth, and it's good to see so many loved faces here, and I'm looking forward to getting to know others. Yeah, so I wanted to actually kind of pause and start with a translation I was kind of working on and also kind of found of 1 Corinthians 13. I'm still a little bit in the Valentine's Day spirit, and was always raised by a very social justice family. So I never really understood that Valentine's Day was supposed to be like a romantic holiday, that it was supposed to be about buying lots of stuff. I always thought it was about doing love and justice. And so I was reading the Bible a little bit yesterday and was thinking about what I should bring to you all today, and wanted to start with this. Love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't hoard or strut or have a swelled head. Love doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first, doesn't keep score of the sins of others. Love doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of justice and of truth, puts up with anything, trusts God always, always looks for the best, never looks back, but keeps going to the end. I was thinking about that in the context of the moment that we're living in. We all have heard that there's 140 million people in this country who are poor, who are one storm or one healthcare crisis or one job loss, one pandemic, or one emergency from economic ruin. And we're living in a society that spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war, on military, on killing. And so very little on love, less than 15 cents on healthcare and education, anti-poverty programs combined. And so I was just thinking about that and thinking about what it means for us then to be coming together and trying to organize. We put out that in the Poor People's Campaign that we're trying to shift the narrative, trying to get this nation, get our communities talking and acting on what are the needs and demands of those 62 million workers who are making less than $15 an hour. And yet we have all these politicians trying to keep their wages so low. What are the needs and demands of those tens of millions of homeless people who live in a country that actually has 5 abandoned houses for everyone that's homeless? Shifting the demands to the needs and the demands of, the half of US children who live in homes that don't have enough food, but we throw away more food than it takes, not just to feed everybody in this country, but across the world. So what does this all mean? You know, one of my favorite passages in Luke is when John the Baptizer is out going into the wilderness. And what's the wilderness but a place for us to that we spend a lot of time in, a place of injustice, a place to try to kind of get away from the trappings of empire. And all these folk come to him and they say, "What then shall we do?" And he has a very clear message back, right? His message is that whoever has 2 coats should share one, that the military, the centurions should stop enacting injustice and violence, stop stealing taxes basically away from people. And just a general message of justice. And I think about that a lot, where I really truly believe that in this country, as we're building this campaign, as we're trying to do this work in our communities, that if we knew what we then should do, so many of us would do it. So many of us would do it. But right now, we live at a time when those who are in power get to say what we then should do. And what's that? That's to let the politicians off, to let presidents, do whatever they want and have no accountability. That's to have our faith leaders become priests of empire rather than chaplains for a movement. And it's to let it's to ignore the truths of our Constitution and of our sacred teachings of putting people before profit and mammon and inequality. So I want to share with you all today a little bit of not just the hows and whys and wheres and wherefores of what then shall we do. Though there are surely many lessons of how we organize, how we come together, and how we build these unlikely alliances, and what it is to lift up and promote the leadership of those who are most impacted. But also the kind of theological and biblical foundations for doing so. The why we have to engage in a theological, nonviolent battle, but doing so where, not any time goes by before any of us, talk about this issue of addressing racism or ending poverty, where there isn't a theological barrier to doing some of that work. And so I want us to talk a little bit about that, and then to get into some of what does this look like for us? What does this mean at this moment of history? I want to start a little bit with some of my own reflections, having done organizing work and ministry for more than 25 years. And as I have began to organize as a part of this movement, as a part of a movement to address racism and poverty, to take up the issues of our day, people have said to me over and over again that our goals are just too ambitious, that demanding human rights and human dignity for everybody, that's both politically inconceivable and it's impossibly expensive. People will quote the Bible, especially this favorite passage of mine, that where Jesus says, "The poor will be with you always," as an argument that it can't be God's will that everyone shares in the abundance of our world. But when I read the Bible, and this is true from the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian New Testament, but this is true of sacred texts from so many of our world's religious traditions. But when I read the Bible, including and especially these statements, including the one from Jesus where he says, "The poor will be with you always," what is clear from Genesis through the New Testament through Revelation is a constant revelation a revelation of God's will that no one should be made hungry or sick or homeless or underpaid or indebted or bereft by the violence of social injustice. In our text, there's this ongoing indictment of those who would take and keep the wealth of our world for themselves and cause others to suffer. Instead, we have the biblical command to fill the hungry with good things. We hear from Jeremiah, nations are supposed to do no wrong to the immigrant, the homeless, and the children, and not to shed innocent blood. And so throughout this scripture, throughout the codes and the policies and the laws and the regulations and the prophets, there's this instruction, there's this call to end exploitation, to attend to the poor, to have Sabbath and Jubilee, to prohibit charging interests, to command that we must pay our workers a living wage and do it so quickly, immediately, not over lots of years. To bring equity to legal proceedings, to give everyone who asks of you, to welcome immigrant neighbors in, to make sure that the needs of the poor are met, and to stop depriving those rights. And so whether it's in the books of Moses, or the prophetic critique, or the parables, or the ministries, God's beautiful creation is held up, and God's intention that abundance has to be a blessing for all, not just a couple, not just an elite few, not just, the rich, but that's indeed a central theme. And whenever policies to share in the kind of blessings of creation are lifted up, we're always reminded that exploitation and oppression and the need to struggle for liberation is a constant need. Because we might forget that empire and unjust policies and immoral systems lead to poverty, but this isn't God's will. So part of what I want to bring today is this message that ending poverty is possible. Ending poverty is possible. And actually, even that passage that is actually my favorite one from Matthew 26, what the poor will be with you always, that's a reference to just such policy, just such reminders from the Hebrew scriptures that is about, forgiving debts. It's about releasing slaves. It's about paying workers a living wage. It's about organizing society around the needs of the poor. To me, it's important for us to think some about this biblical mandate for justice, this message of prosperity and justice for all, because we can often, get numbed by all of the other messages that we hear in society, that living wages are going to hurt our economy, that businesses are going to have to close, that the best we can do is to alleviate a little of the suffering by charity programs, or even maybe moratoriums on evictions, but never forgiving people's rent. And that might be what the Caesar of our day says. That might be what those in power in society want, but that is nowhere in our sacred texts and traditions. And it actually has no place in our Constitution either. And I think that part of why this matters is because if we're going to end poverty with our hands, with our bodies in the world, we have to end it in our minds. If we're going to actually address systemic racism, and not just by holding hands and singing Kumbaya and saying we all hate white supremacy, but if we're going to actually take into account that 60% of Black people in the richest country in human history, are experiencing poverty, that 65% of Latinos are experiencing poverty, that it's more likely that many kids in our public schools today, whether they're in New York City, whether they're in Rochester, or whether they're in Elmira, New York, are more likely to go to prison if they're poor than to graduate. Then we have to see, is there some theology, some heretical theology that's going on that makes it okay for that to be the case. In the Poor People's Campaign, you know, we start often with these maps that show that these injustices that we're facing in our lives today are indeed connected, and that the same politicians who want to suppress wages and suppress votes are there colluding together. And so when we often will put out these maps together, we'll see that the states and the communities that are trying to push back against expanding votes and suppress people's very voice and right to vote are the same states that have the highest rates of poverty among women, among children, amongst Black people, amongst white people, amongst Latino people, amongst Indigenous people. They're the same states that have the fewest environmental protections, the same communities, same politicians that are blocking that. The same communities, the same politicians, the same states that are making sure that LGBTQ folks do not have any rights. But they're also the same communities, the same places where many folks identify as being either Protestant evangelicals or people of faith. What that says is that what has become to be known as theology, as moral issues of our day, is a theology that goes completely against the message of our sacred texts and traditions. The word evangelical comes from the Greek evangelion. Evangelion means good news. And whenever it shows up in our sacred texts and traditions, including in that Gospel of Matthew, where the poor will be with you is so strong and clear, it's always connected to righteousness, to justice, and an end to oppression. Good news isn't just a spiritual idea. It's not just saying Jesus is my personal savior. Good news is ending eviction. It's expanding voting rights. It's raising wages. It's the end to racism. It's an end to poverty. It's saving the earth and everything that lives in and on it. That's what good news is. And anything else is a distortion of what could be and should be. So, I'm going into this because, again, if we go back to that Luke text of what then shall we do, we have to do what our deepest traditions, our deeper sense of justice. We might not be people of faith ourselves, but we might see that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, and we have the right and the responsibility to bend it there a little bit faster. And when we do that, that means coming forward, not just with that poverty and racism and the destruction of the earth. The militarization of our communities is unfortunate, but inevitable, but with a strong message that this is not the way our society can go. This is not God's will for us. And we must wake up every day thinking about, how do we build a movement? How do we build a movement that makes the real moral issues of our day, those that are in our lives, in our communities? The real moral issues of our day are healthcare and expanding healthcare. The real moral issues of our day are living wages and lifting the poor up. The real moral issues of our day are making sure that everybody has a guaranteed adequate income. That moms and older people are cared for. That immigrants are welcomed, embraced, lifted up. That prisoners are freed. And that every yoke of oppression is broken. And when we start from there, when we start from this place that it is not only not inevitable, but it is against the will of God and of our highest values, whether they're in the Declaration of Independence or in our Constitution and our state constitutions, then we can kind of figure out what it's going to take for us to organize to make it so. When we look at history, we look at moments of great social transformation. Those only come when those that are most impacted by injustice are in the lead of strong movements to abolish that injustice. And when leaders of faith are involved, both as those that are impacted and those who are morally injured by that injustice, as moral standard bearers, we can look throughout history at these moments of great reconstruction, of great transformation. You know, we follow the words of someone like Frederick Douglass, who says, those who would be free must strike the first blow. Those in pain know when their pain is relieved. And then we hear the words of Frederick Douglass again, who says, I prayed and prayed to God, and I only received an answer when I started praying with my feet. That this is what we're called to do. We're supposed to model ourselves after past movements where those who would be free, those who only have their chains to leave them, must lead, but that all must be involved. And those movements are not just about one policy. They're not just about one program. They're not just about one soup kitchen. They're not just about one housing takeover. They're about movements that actually combine work in our streets, in our courts, and in our legislature. And they're movements that aren't just when there's the most bad Caesar in office, when the most clear politician who is against the rights of people, but they're about permanently organized communities. They're about being at the ready to push for justice and at the ready to push against injustice. You know, a favorite passage again from the scriptures is a parable about this widow in Luke, who needs and wants justice for her and her family and her community. And she goes to this unjust judge. And I think it's brilliant. The Bible talks about how this judge does not give a damn for any person nor for God. And if you look at that passage, that unjust judge never changes. He doesn't become a good guy in the end. He isn't like, oh, I saw the error of my ways and now I'm going to join a movement. He is unjust at the beginning. He's unjust at the end. He hates God at the beginning. He hates God at the end. And guess what? That woman gets her justice. She is the one who has power. Just like our movement is the one that can build power. And when we're persistent, and when we're resilient and we keep going back and organizing and clearly articulating who we are and what we demand, we can indeed get justice. And then we can keep on going. And one of the things that's brilliant about that passage is it's supposed to be a passage about praying and praying ceaselessly and with encouragement. That's what praying is. That's what being active in our religious life is. It's about banding together with those who need and demand justice and going back until not just that we move those people in power's minds, but until we win justice. And so how do we do that? How do we do that? You know, there's a couple of passages that I wake up every morning and read just as a kind of practice. And one is from Dr. King. So anyone that's ever heard me talk before has probably heard a couple of my favorite King quotes. I have a favorite King quote for most occasions. But really the one that I wake up every morning and read. He says in December of 1967, when he's announcing the fact that he and the welfare rights movement and Indigenous Americans and others across the country are calling for the need for a poor people's campaign. He says, the poor and dispossessed of this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize, not against the lives of their fellow citizens, but against the structures which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people with little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And then he continues and he says, beginning in the new year, we'll be calling thousands of the poorest citizens to Washington to learn nonviolent skills. Those who want to build this freedom church, this nonviolent, intergenerational army of the poor will come and keep organizing. I think in that quote, it kind of captures so much. It starts off with the injustice of our society. And we actually have to start there. We have to actually understand what is going on in our society and see that it's not that the system isn't working, it's working the way it was structured to be. And that it's structured to impoverish and dispossess millions while the rich get away living off of the backs of the poor. And then it says that folks have to organize, not organize just against individuals, not just be angry that Bill Gates or George Soros are making so much money, and that our governor in New York refuses to raise the taxes on the richest New Yorkers, but against the structures that allow for billionaires to make $1 trillion at the same time that 45% of the poorest families in this country have lost income. We have to organize. We have to organize against the structures because the means are at hand to lift the load of poverty. And then he continues and says, basically, every morning when you wake up, you should think about who has little or even nothing to lose. And you should think, how can I help that group of people, those groups of people, those alliances in our movement to be able to take action together? Not just individually, not just we're going to do, a protest over here and a living wage battle over there. How are we going to take action together? Because what that will do is be a new and unsettling force. That will mess this system up, and that will cause people to ask questions about why is it that we have this level of injustice? Why is it that we're living through the greatest health crisis in over a century, and we have lost people from having health care, right? We gotta mess up this system. We have to unsettle. We have to know that normal wasn't working, so we can't go back there. And then how do we help folks to take action together and to build the power of those who, again, would be free. That's the charge that we have in front of us. How do we join a movement? How do we build a movement? How do we take leadership in a movement that pulls these injustices together, pulls the people that are impacted by them together, and then moves forward together in strategy, in vision, in bold policy, and in action? That's it. That's what we got to do. And when we do that, and if we do that, we can win the same justice that widow won against that unjust judge. You know, a lot has been said about change in history and what it's going to look like, you know, this year. What we know is that we have to keep on organizing and keep on pushing. What we know is that in 1964, a segregationalist was elected into office. He was maybe better than the person he was running against, but Lyndon Baines Johnson was still a segregationalist. And what we know is in 1965, the power of the movement was so great that segregationalist passed the most sweeping voting rights and civil rights legislation at that point in history. We have the power to push. We have the power to come together and demand not compromise, not patience, not slow, not moderation, not gradualism, but we need justice now. And we're going to keep on organizing until we get it. So I think I actually want to pause and turn this now into a conversation. Y'all are doing some really powerful organizing in New York, and I'm very proud to be a New Yorker and a part of the New York Poor People's Campaign. And I want to think a little bit with you all about, you know, some of the work that is in front of us. You know, we're doing these Moral Mondays. We're pushing on a resolution. We're trying to make sure that you know, we build this power, build this permanently organized power in our states, in our communities, in our locales. And so I want us to think a little bit about what are some of the barriers to the work y'all are doing? What are some of the amazing places where you're achieving and building? And why is it that, and how is it that we figure out what then shall we do? So thanks so much.
Round of applause for Liz. Thank you so much, Reverend Liz. That was incredible. So we are going to take a moment for some questions. We're going to go up until just about 10:30. So if you have any reflections or questions, please throw them in the chat. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to mention that at the bottom of your screen, if you need captions, there should either be a closed caption button or a ... that you can click on for subtitles, just in case you need captions and you weren't getting them. So let me take a look at this chat and see if we've got any questions here. Well, I will read out what Becca wrote. Hi, Becca. One big barrier in this part of New York State is the isolation and distance of rural areas. It's hard to find ways to bring folks together, particularly in the pandemic times. I know we all feel that.
I think that's so true. And I think one of the lessons of movement in general is that, you know, we have to start with, you know, when 2 or 3 are gathered, we have to, and maybe it's not gathered even in person, maybe it's gathering over Zoom. I think a lot of times we worry about, how do we connect and how do we grow big when we're so spread out, when we're so isolated, when so much is going on in all of our lives. And, I really think, and what history seems to show is that when we start, not even small, but when we start where we are, and build from there, reach out to people, find out, what is going on in other people's lives, and try to figure out how do we solve the problems of people's lives, that then, we're able to kind of bring people together that normally aren't brought together. And we're able to make people feel that they're not alone, because they aren't. And we're able to break through some of that, that fear and that despair, and that thought that, like, we're not powerful, when we're actually so incredibly powerful, especially when we come together. And so, I think in this moment, everything from, reaching out to folks and finding out who is lost people, that's, and then memorializing them and lifting them up, whether it's through the Poor People's Camp Memorial Wall or other kind of, memorial services and activities that people are doing, whether it's, getting a sense from people of what are some of the biggest things that they want to push on right now and they need to push on right now, and connecting it to what we're doing, across New York and across the country. I think that this is such a difficult moment for so many people, and it already was difficult. And now when we can't kind of be with people, I think that there's that need to kind of reach out to people and build commonality together and break that isolation, is so very important.
I see a hand raised from Reverend Olivia. Do you have a question that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yep. You sound good.
Oh, okay. Reverend Liz, I just want to thank you so much for sharing what you shared. It's a two-part question. The first question, I love your philosophy as far as what to do next in leadership and movement. And I know that Jesus has said two things. He said that we will do greater works than him. And nobody explains that. And also, he said, the truth will set you free. And you hear the truth about historically about what has happened, but no, here and there, but that's never a focus. That's never, going back to history, going back to Columbus, going back how racism started, the race, going all the way back. And I truly believe in what he said, the truth. And it's bittersweet. As we all know, the truth is bittersweet. But I feel if people knew the truth and start telling them the truth instead of little bits and pieces and focus on that truth, that's the freedom. That's the freedom. And we need to start talking the truth. And I think that would change our whole at the action, taking action together. Like we all are a different faith, but that's okay. We all connected, as you said. And I think one main thing is fear. Fear is the barrier of telling and focusing on the truth. And the truth could be a movement. That's the movement. Telling the truth, shame the devil. So I just wanted to share that, and I believe in so much what you said. And I wanted to know how long, since you've been in the Poor People's Campaign for so long, have you spoke about what you said about us coming together as a movement? And if so, why are we still going through this? Why are we still doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results? Thank you.
I think I love all of that. I love all of that. I think indeed we have to speak the truth, and we gotta put out a truth that people both don't want to hear, but also then that get moved to here, right? Including, you know, the truth that you were talking about the original sins of this nation, right? The genocide of indigenous peoples, the U.S. chattel slavery and the enslavement of African peoples, and then the way that, you know, really our whole history is about this divide and conquer, exploit and exclude, and you know, allow for a very few to just gain immense political and economic power by stealing it from so many people. And I think that also then the kind of counter of the truth is that actually that level of racism and white supremacy, that level of poverty and inequality costs our society so greatly. It costs in economic numbers, right? I mean, the fact that that our country spends wastes $1 trillion because we have poor kids in this country, and we would save for every dollar spent on addressing on early childhood education programs and other issues of other programs of kind of social uplift of kids. We save $7 in the future. So economically, you know, not only morally and materially is inequality, you know, costing, whether it's with the lives of those that are getting sick or being imprisoned or being battered, but also with just what it looks like, right? The impact that it has, and then also any society that has this level of racism, has this level of brutality and violence, has this level of inequality and poverty, you know, actually brings everybody down, and so that truth has to be told, because the good news on that side of that bad truth is that it doesn't have to be this way, that we could do better, we could do different, and that actually when we eliminate systemic racism, when we enact a fair taxation program, when we defund and redirect military expenses and costs and put it towards real issues of national and international security, like healthcare and wages and adequate income and welfare, that it changes and that everybody is lifted up. So the last thing I would say, and I know that there's other comments and questions, is that yes, I have been doing this work for a long time, just like so many of the people here have been. I think that as opposed to this kind of idea that just doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is insanity. I think if we look at, prophetic leaders in history, someone like Mrs. Rosa Parks, who we just celebrated her birthday, last week. She talks about how she had a long life of being rebellious, right? It wasn't just that she got tired on that bus that one day, and I'm hearing my kids hear all of these myths, and it wasn't that once she helped to win the desegregation of the busing system in Montgomery, that she then went on vacation, but that for decades before and until she died, many, many decades later, in the South, in the North, in the East, in the West, she and others had to keep on organizing and keep on fighting and saw real victories in their lifetime. And then also saw real loss that then she passed on to others to keep on fighting. And so why I, feel hopeful every day is that I have seen us be able to achieve things that people did not think were possible. And I know that so much more is needed. And therefore we must to keep going. So I think there were other, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Reverend Olivia and Reverend Liz. We do have some good questions, so I'm going to go two at a time, if that's all right. One we've got from Beth is, are you heartened by the comparative success of progressive political voices? And another from Earl, who says, so many of us here are professionals, leaders in faith communities that are rather prosperous. It's a challenge for us to be in actual contact with the most affected in our communities. Is that just because I'm retired, or is this a general issue?
So both of these are really important. I might start with the second one, because I think actually my answer to it connects with the first. So I remember preaching to a church one time, like early on in my kind of pastoring, and kind of friend and colleague of mine and mentor of mine, Barbara Lundblad, who is a ELCA, a beautiful preacher, said that I should use basically the Acts 4 text where it says there was no needy among them, because I was going to be preaching at a church that had no connection to poor people, and kind of challenge people of like, is the kind of message of there not being poverty and inequality a message of not a connection to it, or to the elimination of it. And so I've thought about that a lot. I mean, I think, we live in a nation, again, that has about half of its population experiencing some forms of poverty, and maybe even a deep poverty. And so I think poverty and inequality is out there in ways that we don't even recognize, and that are closer than many of us think. But also what has happened is that our society has done a real job on us where we do have these really big barriers between, and I think we see this in this pandemic, right? Those who can afford to be working online, be ordering groceries in, you have contact with those that are needy because they're basically, one of our Moral Mondays leaders, said this, they can afford to have people like me come and kind of outsource all of their essential work, right? So that's real, and that is getting even more the case, right? I mean, I my kids go to New York City public schools. There's the defunding of our schools. This remote learning is surely creating a deeper chasm than existed before, and already there was. Because there are families that can afford basically private tutors, but the majority of people can't, right? I mean, 70% of kids in our schools are living in families that are that couldn't afford things before this pandemic, let alone now. And so I think what we are seeing is deeper division, is a deeper chasm in society. And the question of how do we kind of reach over that breach, and how do we connect with folks is a real one. But it's also that we're living in a society where half, and now a growing number of more people, are experiencing these issues. And so I think it's everything from, where are people accessing food in your community to what campaigns exist are cropping up around moratoriums on eviction, to where are people, hearing about utilities being cut off. I mean, again, these are happening in massive numbers right now. And I think, we do, especially as leaders of faith communities, have, the responsibility to be aware of where that's happening, and then, trying to breach some of those, repair some of those breaches, and try to, reach over some of those chasms. And so that gets me then to this question of am I pleased by some of the kind of progressive changes? I'm pleased that the power of poor and low income people has gotten to the place that it has, that we're able to be pushing around some of the issues that we're pushing, right? If it weren't for low wage workers and the Fight for 15, who has been struggling and pushing for years now, we would not have this Raise the Wage Act. We would not be considering including raising wages in a COVID relief package, right? And that's who's made those kinds of progressive changes possible. And then we had to vote people in that were at least amenable to some of those changes, right? But I think we have to see where the change comes from. The change comes from people pushing, poor and low income people pushing and pushing and pushing. And so I think it means that I'm pleased that there's that we had candidates in this past election who at least had to talk about, like Joe Biden did when he came to the Poor People's Campaign's digital gathering in September, that if he was elected, that ending poverty won't just be an aspiration, it'll be his theory of change. That was not just exciting to hear him say because I wanted to hear him say it. That's because people like y'all selves and like folks without healthcare and folks without childcare have been pushing and pushing and pushing and shifting that narrative, right? And so I think it's really important for us to see that that's where this kind of change comes from, and that's how we're going to be successful in it. It's not enough for people to have lip service. It's not enough to hear what we want to hear, but not to get it, and not to get it now. And it's going to take people continuing to put pressure and organize. And I know that it can be done because it's the only thing that ever has been successful. And so I do feel encouraged right now. But I feel encouraged because we now are in a place where we can continue to push. And when we continue to push, we can see again some of the victories that we need to see. Not because we want to see them, but because people's lives depend on them. And I think that is hopeful. And it shows a way towards, a more just society. But it starts with poor people, low income people, low wealth people, folks, who are experiencing systemic racism, folks that are impacted first and worst by the climate crisis, folks that are being drafted basically to go fight in rich people's wars because there's a poverty draft, even if there isn't an actual draft in our country. And that as we move and as we move together and as we lift up these kind of demands, these needs, these bold visionary policy prescriptions that are coming out of grassroots communities, I feel like we can do this, right? And we're going to do it, and it will be powerful as we keep on doing it.
So this is so powerful, and I know we're getting to the end of this segment, but I have two great questions in this chat that I like to close us out with, if you would, Liz. Thank you so much. One is from Pauline, who asks, how do we maintain faith in our organizing when corporate power keeps robbing our people of resources? How do we maintain connectivity instead of division? And Michael asks, here in Rochester, we are dealing with reoccurring instances of racially motivated police brutality. How do we get non-people of color to understand the pain and suffering we experience from this abuse?
These are, huge, huge questions, and the real ones that are in front of us, right? I like questions like this because they're not easy. There isn't like a 2-line answer, because they're the real questions of our day. So I think how we kind of stay in struggle and how we maintain hope that even despite the fact that those who are in power and have a lot of wealth and power are using that to keep us down, is that, it's the only thing that has ever changed society is when people like us, get together. And that it's actually when, it's when empire, it's when systems of power look like they're infallible, when look like they're all powerful. Again, I take a lot of inspiration, and Reverend Barbara's been using one of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass right after the Dred Scott decision, where, when things look like all hope is lost, is the very moments that we must, embolden our agitation and keep on pushing. Because, as we've heard from some of our brothers and sisters in South Africa, that dying mules are the ones that kick the hardest. That it's when those in power are actually seeing their injustice and inequality crumble around them, that's when they double down. That's when it looks really bad, and we are the ones that are most impacted by that, right? I mean, it is this point of just that over and over again we have our police killing Black bodies, killing Indigenous bodies, shortening people's lives, and it does not seem, even if people are now willing and happy to have some slogans or to have our corporations in the world talking about how Black Lives Matter. It still is not the case in our policy. It's not the case in the actions of our law enforcement officials, not just the individuals, but the whole system. But again, the way that we have seen throughout history, and we've seen today, is that when folks that are impacted organize, that reaches out and brings in people from all walks of life. And that is what's hopeful about this moment. And so, we need the Poor People's Campaign of New York, and we need faith leaders in the Poor People's Campaign of New York, making sure that we are holding up these injustices, making, shifting this narrative, getting our society to actually address those issues, including the brutality that is occurring in our communities, and then coming together and building power amongst, all people, but starting with those who are most impacted. My video's off. All right, sorry. But yeah, I think it's great to be with everybody. I really appreciate the work that everyone's doing, and thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all today. As we say in our work, we're going to move forward together and not one step back, and I truly believe that to be the case.
That's right. Thank you so much, Reverend Liz. Everyone, a round of applause or some hands. Thank you so much. And such great questions, and I so appreciate that point of like these are the questions that we're moving forward with. So with that in mind, please keep your questions in mind, write them down, because we're going to have breakout groups right after a short break, and I'll actually pop it over to Vicky to lead us into our short break. Thank you so much, Reverend Liz.
Thank you. Actually, this has been such a powerful morning. Hang on, folks. And I know for myself, I took a million notes. I know that there are so many questions still ringing and buzzing in our heads. What great food for thought we have to bring into the breakout groups. We're going to take a short break. We'll come back at 10:45, and we want folks to stay on Zoom. So for this break time. If you can stay on Zoom, just stay, you can take your camera off and obviously stay muted and then return at 10:45. But we wanted to make sure that if you need captioning, that you are renaming that need in your name, put it in your name that you need captioning, so we make sure that you are placed in the right breakout. So it's a short break right now, and we're back at 10:45. It's about 10 minutes. Thanks, folks. Stay here.